So the next group of plants that we're going to talk about are the seed plants. And within the seed plants, we have two general categories, the gymnosperms, which is what this video is about, and the angiosperms, which will be our next video. And again, as a reminder, these seed plants, seedless vascular, seedless non-vascular, those are kind of loose classifications of our different types of plants, but really what we're looking at is the different phyla that share those characteristics. So let's talk about seed plants in general. So seed plants have vascular tissue, just like we saw with our ferns. They have xylem and they have phloem. It's exactly the same in our seed plants. But here's a unique characteristic. Whereas our ferns and our mosses had to have water for reproduction, they had to have water to literally have something for that sperm to swim in. We don't see that with the seed plants anymore. They have developed some adaptations to reduce their dependence on water. Now, of course, they still need water to grow and to photosynthesize, but they don't have to have it for reproduction. Because of this, because they are no longer tied to water for reproduction, they can live in a lot more habitats. Deserts are now accessible to them, and we're going to see some of those deserts. They can live in some of the coldest and some of the driest areas on Earth now because they don't have to use that water anytime they want to reproduce. You are going to start seeing the development of different adaptations to hold on to water. Again, that water being used for photosynthesis and for general life, not for reproduction. And then we also see the evolution of seeds. Now, again, these are characteristics of seed plants in general. We're going to talk more about gymnosperms here soon. So seeds in general, essentially what they're doing is they're protecting the embryo. They're protecting the zygote. They're protecting the result of egg and sperm. And as a side note, egg and sperm still exist. It's just that need for water is different. These seeds are protecting it by protecting that developing embryo from harsh conditions, whether it's dry, whether it's too wet, whether it's too sunny or too shady. I don't know. Protect it. Even protecting it from predators or from herbivores that are eating those seeds. And also seeds are like a jump start of nutrition. Seeds are filled with fats and proteins and sugars that are needed for a developing embryo and a developing plant. So it's almost like the seed has its own fertilizer to give it a leg up in life. Now, the two categories of gymnosperms that we'll be exploring are the the two categories of seed plants we'll be exploring are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Both gymnosperms and angiosperms have seeds, but gymnosperms lack a fruit. We refer to them as a naked seed. It is the seed, there's nothing around it. Whereas angiosperms have a seed, but then have a fruit around it. So let's talk about these gymnosperms a little bit more. So there's no flowers, there's no fruits, they got seeds, but that's about it. Seeds are released into the environment and good luck. So not much support there for the seeds. There's a couple of different phyla of gymnosperms. The most predominant one, though, is Phylum Coniferophyta. Your pine trees, right? Like every pine tree that you see is in Phylum Coniferophyta. These pine trees have pine cones, like you see I'm in the picture on the right-hand side. I think of every type of Christmas tree, like the Douglas fir or the eastern spruce. In your yard, you might have a white pine. All of these organisms are in Phylum Coniferophyta. They have needles. We're not going to talk about the adaptations of needles, but just letting you know, those needles are actually an adaptation for water loss, I think that everything's cool, but it's pretty cool. And they all have cones. And while we'll talk about the life cycle here in a moment, those cones are where the seeds are found. Now, the cone isn't a fruit, though. The cones literally just open up and drop the seeds, hence the naked seed part of this. So let's talk about cones. Now, typically, when you think of cones, I'm going to put both of the images up. When you think of a pine cone, you probably think of the types of cones you see on the right-hand side, or from our previous picture, this kind of pine cone. That is a pine cone, but that's actually the female cone. That pine cone is where the seeds are found, and we're going to talk about how those seeds come to play here soon. So when you see a pine cone, you are essentially seeing the female reproductive organ of a pine tree. They also have male cones, and it's hard to imagine it as a cone because in your mind, you're probably like, no, a cone is like the large solid thing. But there are male cones. That's what you see here on the left-hand side. These are much smaller. To give you a reference of scale, each one of those little cone things, it depends on the species, but that might be like the top joint of your pinky nail, pinky finger, might be a little bit larger depending on the species. You've seen these before. This is the pollen making things. So these are the male cones. You see parts of them on, especially in our area, on our cars, on the street, on sidewalks. They're all over the place, and they are chock full of pollen, all the pollen. So these are the pollen producing cones. These are the male cones. And so when you see them everywhere, these are males trying to get it on. And we're going to talk about how that happens here soon. So trees have these cones, the female and male cones. Depending on the species, most species, both the male and female cones are found on the same tree, but there are some exceptions. So there are some trees that are only female producing trees and male producing trees, but for the life cycle we're going to draw, and a majority of them, they're on the same tree, so that's how I'm going to draw it. So life cycles! After this one, there's only one left. So again, left-hand side's got the key terms. We got gametophytes, both male and female. We've got gametes, egg and sperm. We got pollen. We got zygotes. We got spores, but we start calling them megaspores and microspores, and more on that soon. We've got ovules, we got sporophytes, we got meiosis, and of course, our beautiful seeds. You notice there is a lot of overlap with the key terms in here, as is the key terms in our mosses and in our ferns. There are some differences, but note, there is a lot of overlap. So, as always, I'm going to draw this on my own screen. You guys can follow along. I'm drawing this in your notes as well. And I'll make sure to use all of these key terms as we are describing this. So, let's go ahead and get our notepad open to start drawing our life cycle. And like the other plant life cycles, I'm going to start with talking about, Like with our other life cycles, I'm going to start with the organism that you see. So we see the tree. That pretty much looks like my moss and my fern. I know, it all looks the same. I'm sorry. Okay, so we're going to start with the tree. So this is the large pine tree that you see. I'm actually going to draw this a little bit larger so that I can put some cones on here. So here's our large tree that you see. Maybe you have these growing in your yard or in your neighborhood. And the tree that we see, that life cycle, that stage of the life cycle is the sporophyte. This is similar to ferns. When we looked at the fern, we're looking at the sporophyte. When we look at our flowering plants, we're looking at the sporophyte. It's just mosses that are weird. Mosses, you're looking at the gametophyte, but all the other ones, you're looking at the sporophyte. I'll actually pause here because we're looking at the sporophyte. This means this is the dominant stage. This is what we're seeing. And again, as a reminder, sporophytes in all of these are going to be diploid. Now I'm going to draw some pine cones. So don't really worry about, it's that far up the tree or that low on the tree. I am drawing this just so I can draw both of them on the tree. They're not relative or anything like that. So I'm going to draw kind of these little skimpy, this is a skimpy male cone, and then I'm going to draw a super big female cone. It looks like a pile of poop, but that'll do. So here we have the male cone and the female cone. Now, these cones, I will label these. So this is the female cone. This is the male cone. This is still part of the sporophyte. Because it's still part of the sporophyte, these are still diploid. This isn't even one of your key terms. But if you're like, what is the pine cone? It's part of the sporophyte. It's just an extension of the sporophyte. It is a diploid structure. Let's actually start with the females. So I mentioned before, we no longer need water. And that's because although our pine trees and our angiosperms are going to undergo all the same steps, a lot of them are reduced. And what I mean by that is there's not a lot of movement happening. So this is all, I'm going to try to draw it like a track. Everything we're about to talk about is happening inside the female cone, inside that female cone on the sporophyte. So that's kind of why I've drawn this track. Everything I'm about to say is all happening inside that female cone. So we are a sporophyte. Sporophytes make spores. And I mentioned we had like special terms. We had a megaspore and a microspore. And the megaspore and microspore are essentially referring to, did it come out of the male reproductive organ or is it coming out of the female reproductive organ? Because we're talking about the female reproductive organ, this is a megaspore. And a megaspore is called mega because it is larger than the microspore. Eventually, the megaspore is going to give rise to eggs. Eventually, the microspore is going to give rise to sperm. An egg is much larger than sperm. So within this pine cone, I don't really have a good way of drawing this. I'm going to apologize now. It's just going to be a bunch of circles, in all honesty. So inside this pine cone, there's a lot of them. Here is our megaspore. I'm just going to set myself up for the males. And because we went from a diploid sporophyte, remember diploid sporophytes undergo meiosis, and when they undergo meiosis, they're going to create spores that are haploid. And I'm going to write meiosis along here because the boys are going to end up doing something very similar. Okay. Typically, what would have happened is these spores get released into the environment and they grow into a gametophyte, but that is not what happens in our seed plants. Everything is very reduced. Everything is happening all in the cone. So in the cone, you've got a megaspore. You've got lots of megaspores. These megaspores in the cone, they never leave. In the cone, stay in the cone, and develop and grow into our next step. Our next step is a gametophyte. I'm going to draw a stripy circle just to show you that this is something different. So it grows into the female gametophyte. So female gametophyte. There was no hanky-panky. There was no fusing. There was no dividing. This is just still haploid. Again, same as what we've seen before. So in our female cone, we've got a megaspore. There's a lot of megaspores. Those megaspores will grow and develop into the female gametophyte inside of that cone. And then that female gametophyte, after it's matured, is going to grow into the female gametes. And I'm just keeping it as an open circle just to represent that it's something different. So this is the gamete. And what is the female gamete? Well, the female gamete is the egg. And this is still haploid. So all the steps of the alternation of generations happened in the pine cone. All happened there. So we went from the female sporophyte, this female cone. It grew megaspores. It developed into the female gametophyte. It developed into the gamete, the egg, and it's still in that pine cone. All right. And that's where we're going to end for the female. So let's jump to what's happening in our male cones. So our male cones, very similar things are happening. So the male cone, part of the sporophyte, the very first step is making microspores. These cones are going to have tons of microspores. Even though the female cone has multiple megaspores, not anything on the scale of what our microspores are making. Like, you're talking about a single pine cone might have maybe 50 megaspores, whereas a male cone might have 1 million microspores. So that's why I'm just drawing more of them right here. So these are much smaller, so they get the special name of microspore. These are the male spores. They did undergo meiosis. This is why I put meiosis kind of right here. So that male cone, the sporophyte, underwent meiosis to create these haploid microspores. These haploid I'm going to make these slightly larger with a line, just again to denote them as something different. These microspores are going to grow into their male gametophyte. So this is the male gametophyte. Again, everything is just happening inside these cones. But this is where things get a little different. So in our females, then the female gametophyte went ahead and grew into the egg. With our males, we've got another step. So our males, the sporophyte created the spores. The spores, or the microspores, created the male gametophyte. There is another name for the male gametophyte, a specific name given to the seed plants. I'm going to use a different color for it. I'm going to use a very bright yellow. The other name for the male gametophyte in seed plants, you're going to see this with our flowering plants too, is called pollen. So pollen is the male gametophyte. Interchangeable. Male gametophyte is pollen. And if you know anything about pollen, you know pollen leaves, right? Pollen is not on that tree. That pollen is out in the environment. So this pollen, I'm going to draw this. This pollen's going everywhere. Pollen, pollen, pollen. If you guys, any of you have seasonal allergies, you're allergic to the male gametophyte, typically that pollen that you're allergic to is coming from pine trees. We'll talk about why here in our next set of videos. But the pollen that you causing itchy eyes, runny noses, it's the male gametophyte of pine trees. So you know that pollen goes out in the world. And if that pollen gets lucky, it lands on a female pine cone. It gets close to that egg. And I'm actually going to draw that pollen right on top of this egg. That pollen is right next to it. Now remember, this is a male gametophyte. There is no sperm yet. So this is why sperm hasn't needed to swim. Because the male gametophyte is what gets released into the world. The gametophyte protects that sperm. I wouldn't even say protects that sperm. It hasn't even made sperm yet. Oh God, this is going to be a horrible analogy. It's a good analogy, but it's a visualization you don't want. But thinking about humans, this would be like, the testes are going out there. The testes still have to make that sperm though. So these male gametophytes still have to go out and they still have to make the sperm. So they aren't sperm. They make the sperm. So this male gametophyte of pollen lands on a gamete. I'll use, I guess, blue. And this blue is representing the sperm being made in that male gametophyte. And then that sperm literally swims like the smallest little space to get to the egg. Like it literally landed on the egg. So the sperm doesn't have to go far to get to the egg. And then it fertilizes that egg. So I'm going to use, like I've used in my other videos, I'm going to use this red to represent, okay, this egg is now fertilized. Now remember, this fertilization is happening on the female cone. So we now have this fertilized egg, and we know fertilized eggs grow into sporophytes. But there's a pause here. That is true. That is totally true. But what we see in our seed plants is instead of trying to directly grow into this pine tree, instead, there's a couple of steps that I'm just going to skip. Instead, what happens is a seed starts developing. I'll use green to represent this. So here we have our egg, and then we're going to get some tissues kind of built around this egg. That's what all this green's representing. So the green's representing this seed. I'll go ahead and write seed next to it. And again, the seed is just, it's proteins, it's sugars, it's fats, it's nutrients that are going to help give this zygote a better chance in developing. It's also going to protect it from harsh conditions. Like its whole goal is to make sure, or help to make sure that sporophyte grows. Now, this is a fertilized egg. This fertilized egg is diploid, right? Like this zygote is diploid. And if it's a diploid zygote, let me just go ahead and write zygote. Sorry. Zygote is diploid. The seed, everything growing around it is diploid. This, I like to think of it as a baby sporophyte. It's still the sporophyte though. And we know sporophytes are diploid because this is the culmination of egg and sperm. So a seed essentially houses a baby sporophyte. And that seed gives it the nutrients it needs to to get a leg up in life, to hopefully ensure its success as a sporophyte. So this seed is a sporophyte in our pine cones. So the female pine cones, they open up and they literally just drop these seeds. Maybe something comes and eats them, maybe not, maybe it just drops. So these seeds just fall out of the pine cones, and fingers crossed, the seed ends up somewhere where it can germinate, aka it can actually start growing into the large or adult sporophyte. So the sporophyte is the seed, and it's also the plant. So the seed, you can just think of it as a baby plant. On our next video, I'm actually going to show you a picture of this. I think it's fascinating. If you're actually to cut open a seed, you can even see the beginning development stages of sporophytes. So go ahead, go back to our slides. This life cycle that you see here, not too bad. It is kind of already been simplified. But again, most everything happening in the pine cones themselves. There is no need for water because the sperm gets delivered to the egg using the male gametophyte. The male gametophyte, that pollen grain, can exist in the environment. It gets to where it needs to go, and then it develops the sperm. In mosses and in ferns, they just develop the sperm, and I was like, all right, we got to get sperm to egg now. What we see in our seed plants is almost a waiting game. Like, hey, we're not going to make that swimming sperm yet until we know we're next to the female. And this change allowed these plants to be able to live in a lot more habitats that we don't see ferns, that we don't see mosses, because they don't have to use water to transport their sperm. So again, our gymnosperms are referring to naked seeds. That seed develops, but then just drops to the ground. Like, that's it. And end of story. Whereas what we're going to see in our angiosperms here soon is that their seed is protected even more so with a fruit.